And welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online. My name is Drew Clark. I'm editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. I'm very excited to welcome you to a special Oxford-style debate around the topic, should the United States ban TikTok? Before we get to that topic, though, I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you for being part of this debate as part of our regular free programming on Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We cover many topics around broadband's infrastructure and impact and big tech and its impact on society. And this obviously is one of them. It's very, very widely talked about now. In some ways, a surprise. 6 months ago, we wouldn't necessarily be having this debate, but we are now, and that's great. We also cover topics in greater depth. Last week, for example, we covered ongoing impact of the Build America, Buy America rules and its impact on broadband infrastructure. And so, that each of our programs, our Wednesday programs, are available free, and we post them online, or they are online immediately afterwards. And so I encourage you to look at our library as well as our ongoing events in the future. We've got a number of great events lined up for next week, May 31st, and the month of June. For those of you who'd like more information, more deeper dives into the topics, we have an exclusive report on the Middle Mile infrastructure project. We did one in March on content moderation. These monthly reports are all available to Breakfast Club members, which you can join for $99 a month and get access to other premium products like the videos and discounted tickets to events such as the Made in America Summit, which ties into our program, right? The theme of our program here today. We'll be talking on June 27th at the Samsung Executive Center for a all-day conference where we're exploring the infrastructure build out, green energy, the Semiconductor and Chips Act, and lots of aspects about the Biden administration's program for effectively reindustrialization of the United States. So these are some of the things that are coming up, and we hope that you will go to Broadband Breakfast to find more out about each of these events. Before I introduce our guests, I want to thank our sponsors. They include Utopia Fiber, Broadband Money, Comcast, Nokia, the Comlog Group, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Lightbox, the Wireless Infrastructure Association, Ookla, Michael Baker International, Bitstream, Positron Access, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. Thank you to our sponsors. And now let me introduce our guests. For most of this debate, I'm going to turn my camera off and listen, but I will be keeping time. And if you don't stick to your time, I am going to pop on and you'll see my face. So that means you're close to your time limit, and we must be strict with the time limit so we can be fair. As I've laid out, the resolution is, should the United States ban TikTok? And so we're going to hear from our four panelists, two on each side, on this resolved. So on the pro side, the U.S. should ban TikTok. We're going to be hearing first from Joel Thaler. Joel is the president of the Digital Progress Institute, and as the president, Joel has been in charge of many issues for the Digital Progress Institute. And before that, he was an associate at Phillips Little and was policy counsel for ACT, the App Association. He also worked as a legal clerk to FCC Chairman Ajit Pai and FTC Commissioner and later Chairwoman Maureen Ohlhausen. The other person on the pro side will be Anton Dubura. Anton is the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Assured Autonomy, and is the executive director of the Johns Hopkins University Information Security Institute. And he's also been an associate research scientist in the Department of Computer Science at the university. So Anton, welcome. We're thank you that you can be with us on this important topic. Representing the con side, the the U.S. should not ban TikTok, we are going to hear first from David Green, who is Senior Staff Attorney and Civil Liberties Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and has been litigating First Amendment issues in state and federal trial and appellate courts. And he also serves on the steering committee of the Free Expression Network, which is the governing committee of the American Bar Association Forum on Communications Law. So David, thanks for being part of the con side. And then Daniel Lyons will be the second debatant on that side. And he is a professor and associate dean of academic affairs at Boston College Law School, where he teaches on telecom, administrative, and cyber law. And he's also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Did I mangle anything terribly? Does anyone need to correct or modify the bios that I just stated? All right.
Well, last name's Thayer. That's it.
Oh, and I apologize, Joel. I recognize a mistake, but thank you for correcting me. So let's go ahead and open our window. As I said at the beginning, I'm going to basically turn my camera off, and highlight the person speaking when it's your turn. We are going to kind of go by a strict clock. So with that, the floor is yours, Joel, to make your points about why the U.S. should ban TikTok.
Well, first, thank you, Drew and Broadband Breakfast, for hosting this important debate on whether the U.S. should ban TikTok. To start, I believe it should, as it poses a serious national security threat. The primary threat rests on three key features. First is the amount of data TikTok collects, the app's ability to spy on Americans, and lastly, TikTok's relationship with the Chinese government. Given all the data it collects, this threat cannot be understated. According to the company's own privacy policy, it collects consumers' real-time location, search history, and biometric data. Reports show that TikTok frequently ignores its users' privacy settings and to listen in even when they're not using the app. On Apple devices, TikTok may even have access to passwords for other apps that users save on their clipboard. To make matters worse, TikTok even openly admits that it may share this data with its foreign affiliates. But which ones? TikTok won't say. Not to you, not to our government, not to anyone. But we know its Chinese parent company ByteDance is certainly one of them. That alone makes TikTok an untenable threat. The reason? Well, ByteDance is subject to China's cybersecurity law, which means that it must share all data with the Chinese government that has a national security implication. Data on TikTok's American TikTok users is almost certainly falls into that category. Worse, a recent study conducted by Internet 2.0 found hard evidence that even without the aid of ByteDance, TikTok on its own connects to mainland China-based infrastructure. In short, if TikTok has your data, most likely, so does the Chinese government. The good news, states are fighting back. As we are all well aware, Montana is the first state to ban TikTok commercially. Given that the state has a serious penchant for deregulation, it's kind of a shocker. To put this in perspective, Montana was the last state to have a speed limit, and yet is now the first state to ban TikTok. But why? According to the law, the threat the app that poses to children and Montanans in general, TikTok's blatant privacy violations, and its ability to commit foreign espionage within the state. Montana's law goes into effect January 1, 2024. Generally, the law imposes a $10,000 fine on TikTok, Google, and Apple each day they make TikTok available to Montanans, unless, however, TikTok cuts ties with ByteDance. It's the first real action we have seen against the app in the US so far. Montana, however, is not the first to raise concerns over TikTok. The federal government is also calling for a commercial ban. TikTok has been the subject of a multi-year, multi-governmental investigation conducted by the Treasury Department's Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, the Department of Justice, and Congress for reasons similar to Montana's law and the threat it poses to our national security. Even President Joe Biden has called for TikTok to cut all financial ties to ByteDance, presumably in part from CFIUS's initial findings. What's more, after listening to TikTok CEO's testimony at a hearing earlier this year, Republican Congresswoman Cathy McMorris Rodgers stated that TikTok has repeatedly chosen the path for more control, more surveillance, and more manipulation, stating affirmatively TikTok should be banned. Democrat Congressman Frank Pallone in the same hearing stated, and I quote, "I still believe that the Beijing Communist government will still control and have the ability to influence what TikTok does." But before the ink could even dry on Montana's law, TikTok and a few Montana TikTok creators sued the state, arguing that the law may be unconstitutional under a few theories. Both briefs assert that Montana's ban violates the First Amendment, but TikTok's brief also includes claims that Montana's law violates the Constitution's prohibition against bills of attainder, or laws that punish an individual without a trial, and the Commerce Clause by attempting to regulate interstate services. Balderdash, I say. As I'm sure we'll get into in more detail, each theory has their own standard and test. But in general, the First Amendment does not prevent Montana or the federal government from regulating non-expressive conduct, especially if it's illicit. The Bill of Attainder prohibition doesn't concern laws that regulate future offenses, only past offenses. Again, the law is prospective in nature, nor does the Commerce Clause prevent states from enacting laws rooted in protecting its consumers and using their police powers, like Montana is doing here with calls to TikTok's violations of consumer privacy, a constitutionally protected right in that state, mind you. With all that said, thank you for the opportunity to participate. I look forward to the conversation.
All right, thank you very much. Joe, we'll turn it now to David for your opening remarks.
Hi, thank you all. I'm happy to be here. So since I only have 5 minutes, I'll get right to it. There are 3 reasons why we should be highly skeptical of efforts to ban TikTok. One is one that Joel has already mentioned, which is the First Amendment. And I'll get back to that later, why I believe it actually does impose a significant barrier on efforts to ban or limit TikTok to US users. The second is that all of the concerns that get raised about TikTok are not unique to TikTok really in any way, and are more properly addressed by comprehensive data privacy regulation rather than a law that applies only to one company. And the third thing is that there are a handful, not more than a handful, there are many, many, many practical barriers to enforcing any type of restriction. I'm going to concentrate on the first 2 parts and let my co-presenter chip in as well. But let me just talk about the First Amendment. I think Joel is correct that the First Amendment does not necessarily prevent any type of restriction on TikTok, but it certainly imposes really significant barriers to any type of governmental restriction on the way that people in this country choose to communicate with each other and choose to receive information. It will certainly be, any type of restriction will certainly be subject to First Amendment scrutiny. This is not a regulation of expressive conduct. This is a regulation of expression. It's a regulation of how people communicate with each other and how they receive communications. Courts in every context have repeatedly held that the act of speaking and communicating and receiving information is not conduct that can be regulated separate from speech. This doesn't mean that it's going to be impossible to ban TikTok. It just means that the government's going to have to show that its concerns are real and that this law, that a ban is an appropriately narrow way of advancing that interest. And I believe that will be very difficult. And one of the reasons that'll be very difficult is going to tie into the second point, which is that all of the concerns about foreign adversaries, and China in particular, having access to US user data are not unique to TikTok. US user data is collected by many companies, both foreign and US based. And that is because we do not have any type of comprehensive data privacy regulation in this country. And once they collect that information, that the US user data is then sold on data markets widely, where foreign adversaries can purchase this information, just like many other interests can as well. If we are really genuinely concerned about preventing the flow of US user data to China or any other foreign adversary, then we should prevent all companies or limit the way all companies collect, retain, and use that data in the first place. The way this fits into the First Amendment analysis is that merely focusing on TikTok is an under-inclusive way of addressing these concerns about US data privacy. It would be really great if Congress would actually take a close look at comprehensive data privacy legislation that would address that problem. But really focusing on a single company is a really under-inclusive, incomplete, and actually an effective way of doing so. And then the third point, there are really practical barriers to how you actually prevent US users from using an app that's commonly available, not just from app stores, but on the web and through other sources. These type of sources actually tend to be much less secure than getting things through the app store. And so when you ban things, if you're going to focus that ban on the app stores themselves, you're actually creating more, you're making data more vulnerable to foreign exploitation. And I think that's my 5 minutes, so I'll rest there.
Thank you for sticking with your time. We will now turn to our second pro speaker, Anton Yabura. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Broadband Breakfast for inviting me to participate in this debate. The United States should consider banning TikTok, and I'll explain why. In the mid-1980s, when I was a researcher at Bell Labs, and years before the advent of the World Wide Web and mobile devices, one of my colleagues, Don Mitchell, mused one day about using the internet for people in a community to exchange views online about community-related issues. It was viewed as an opportunity to create a better informed, more engaged population. The idea was never carried out by my colleague at that time, but I'm certain that no one expected that online social exchange would become the Facebook, Instagram, Truth Social, TikTok, and so on of today. Nor was it envisioned that these platforms could be owned, operated, and controlled indirectly or directly by governments that are adversarial or at least competitive with the United States. Also, back in the early days, I don't remember us considering the magnitude of the data that could be captured about individuals and pipelined to other parts of the world to be analyzed en masse for all kinds of purposes. In recent years, there is ample evidence to support the notion that the Chinese government has become the master of creating these data pipelines to learn about seemingly ordinary Americans in order to gain access to critical infrastructure, persons of interest, and information that can give the Chinese government any kind of advantage. The Chinese have been caught several times that we know of using consumer devices such as DJI drones and infrastructure such as Huawei communication switches to capture the data they want and send them to China. How do they use these data? Well, if we focus just on user location data captured by the GPS functions of mobile devices, we can determine that one can infer where people work, live, and play. And it's not just people who work in a military installation or a nuclear power plant that interest the Chinese. Critical infrastructure now includes at least 16 sectors, including banks and financial institutions, food processors, healthcare, transportation, and so on. Legal offices hold intellectual property. Universities have cutting labs, etc., cutting edge labs. If bad actors know who has access to these facilities, they can target them for spear phishing attacks to infiltrate these IT systems. In addition, knowing who people associate with can give bad actors a pathway to those people as well through Wi-Fi routers and other means. So we have a major problem on our hands, as confirmed by FBI Director Christopher Wray and others. The Chinese government has been caught with its hand in the TikTok cookie jar, and the question is, what now? ByteDance has come up with voluntary efforts to show that the data pipeline to China no longer exists, but can we trust them? Oracle has been auditing TikTok software, but software is so complex that it's risky to declare the software to be free of trapdoors. What would prevent TikTok from issuing, for example, multiple versions of its software to different users so that only a small percentage of users would have the trapdoor, but there would still be a trapdoor? Is a ban of TikTok feasible? I doubt that it is. Will it hurt people who are building businesses from it? Absolutely. But until we have safeguards in place, we need to be cautious about business as usual. What are the safeguards? Security audits, monitoring how data flow to and from devices, third-party certifications of apps, And above all, we need a sensible set of online privacy laws in the United States. A ban is not unprecedented. The United States government has already banned the acquisition of DJI drones by the Department of Defense, and Florida and Arkansas have banned the use of DJI drones for official purposes, with a national ban in the works. And the Biden administration has banned approvals of new telecommunications equipment from China's Huawei Technologies and ZTE because they pose, quote, an unacceptable risk, unquote, to U.S. national security. Therefore, until the appropriate framework is in place to avoid the open and free exploitation of user data obtained from apps such as TikTok, we are going to see extreme mitigation efforts to counter those abuses, including outright bans of the apps. Since our current style of government is decidedly reactive, let's force the issue regarding banning TikTok and other apps, and there are many, in order to produce sensible policies and methodologies for protecting Americans for their online lives. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks again for sticking to the time. Our closing speaker will be Daniel Lyons. The floor is yours.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this exchange. I want to build a little bit on my colleague David's remarks. So David outlined the First Amendment test to propose TikTok ban, right? The government has to show an important interest unrelated to speech, and that the measure in question is not burdening substantially more speech than necessary to achieve that interest. Now, I think you can argue that the intelligence issues that are drive the TikTok ban movement are theoretically important, but right now I think they're unproven. We've not seen a lot of fact finding either at the congressional or at the state level to show that there is a legitimate interest here that is concrete rather than theoretical. But even if we concede that there is a proven sort of important interest, a TikTok ban, like many other internet regulations, tends to burden far more speech than necessary in order to address that interest, right? When you're talking about banning TikTok nationwide, it's not just key, potentially valuable information that might fall in the hands of the Chinese government. You're talking about banning millions of TikTok videos and sea shanties and countless other messages that have no intelligence value whatsoever. When courts engage in this type of analysis, they ask the question, are there less intrusive options that might address the government's concerns without this extensive chilling effect on speech? And I think there are a number of other alternatives that are potentially on the table. One is a proposal that TikTok itself has made to CFIUS, right? This that goes under the code name of Project Texas. TikTok has offered to segregate its American operations and put it under the control of a board of directors appointed by CFIUS, storing its data in the United States on Oracle managed servers, using the Oracle as sort of a third-party gatekeeper to control very carefully the flow of American information that goes to China. Assuming that winds up being a potentially useful way of addressing the government's concerns, it strikes me as a much better alternative that doesn't have the First Amendment problems that an outright TikTok ban has. The parallel, I think, is Packingham v. North Carolina, which was a 2017 decision where the state of North Carolina was preventing convicted sex offenders from using social media because of concerns about recidivism. I think the court unanimously agreed that protecting children from sex offenders was an important governmental interest, but limiting sex offenders' ability to use social media was a far broader inhibition on their speech than necessary to address that interest. And what a TikTok ban supposes is putting even greater controls than that, not just on sex offenders, but on all Americans. But I think even if you were to acknowledge the legality of a TikTok ban, it seems to me that any ban is more likely to be security theater than a really effective policy measure. In short, with 150 million users in the United States, the horse is out of the barn. It would be very hard to enforce a TikTok ban. There's a number of proposed paths out there, but none of them strike me as likely to succeed. I think the most common is this idea of a ban on app stores, which was referenced a little bit earlier. That might have the effect of controlling downloading of existing new TikTok applications on devices, but your Android users can still sideload from third-party providers, and Apple could too if the Apple user is jailbroken. More importantly, users can still access TikTok through a browser-based interface, and an app store would not prevent that. Some of the proposed bans have looked at putting sort of business restrictions on companies being unable to do business with TikTok. That may reduce TikTok's financial incentive to operate in the United States, but would not address these sort of alternate routes by which consumers and end-user consumers can access and use the app. And the sort of death penalty prospect, this idea of an absolute block and punishing all individual users in the United States that would continue to use the app, is something that A, strikes me as fairly draconian. Even the Montana ban doesn't go that far. But B, would require a significant change to the way the internet operates in order to enforce. We would have to adopt the type of firewalls that historically we have not used to control the flow of data on and off our shore, because we think it's inconsistent with this idea of the open internet. And I think it would be unfortunate if, to try to beat China, we wind up becoming China ourselves and selling out the free expression and open internet principles that we tend to mark as the hallmark of our society. Thank you.
Well, very crisp points, and thank you to each of our panelists, debaters, and we haven't even gotten halfway through the discussion. So here's how we're going to proceed. I'm going to give at least 2 minutes, maybe additional minute or two wiggle room to each side. Let's give the pro side the 2 minutes first, and then the con side the 2 minutes, and then we'll have opportunity for your questions. So now's the opportunity. If you've got questions, you can share them on Zoom or the other platforms that we're live casting on, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Go ahead and send your questions in. I'll put those together. I've got questions of my own. We have about a 10 minute window in there where we'll ask them. And then at 11:44, we will go to closing arguments by each of the 4 debaters. So let's turn to our pro team of Joel and Anton. What would you respond to that have been raised by David and Daniel?
Well, and I'll get to this in my closing remarks, but I think there's a lot we agree on, more than we disagree on. But I'll stick for the 2 minutes, purpose of 2 minutes on what we disagree on. So the opposition raised the First Amendment. So let's talk about it. Well, regarding the First Amendment, courts have consistently distinguished between conduct and speech to determine whether the First Amendment is applicable or prohibitive towards the enactment or enforcement of a particular policy. In the U.S. Supreme Court case, Arcara v. Cloud Books, the New York State government shut down an adult bookstore for health violations because its owner used his store to facilitate prostitution. Even though we think of a bookstore as a quintessential venue for First Amendment activity like TikTok or social media, the Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment did not prevent the government from shutting down the bookstore because the government was acting based on the owner's decision to engage in prohibited non-speech conduct, in this case, the solicitation of prostitution. Laws like Montana and other federal ideas target the conduct of app stores and the app itself, as opposed to the content occurring on the app. So focusing on the app's business relationship that poses a significant national security risk or a risk to the state, as opposed to targeting users, almost certainly ensures, as it did in New York in Arcara, that it will pass constitutional muster. So Packingham was also invoked. So I have a few issues with that analogy. For one, the ban the ban on in North Carolina had to do with placed the burden on the individual user. And in this case, we're talking about a ban on the company itself. So I don't know if that's a good analogy that gels well, but a better analogy, and as my colleague brought up, is probably the instance in which the government has banned communication company from operating in the US, like Huawei. For instance, the FCC banned Chinese-owned communication company Huawei from entering into our networks. The DC Circuit upheld the banning of those companies from our markets without a scintilla of concern regarding the First Amendment. And even under the opposition's view of the First Amendment, all the government would need to show is a restraint on speech, if any, is narrowly tailored to support a significant government interest, and there are reasonable alternatives. Protecting national security is definitely a significant interest, if not compelling. The government banning an app that directly threatens it would be sufficiently tailored to that interest, and a ban that would be limited to TikTok only, leaving access to other social media sites like Instagram, Snapchat. Thus, it almost certainly passes that constitutional muster. But I will say I do agree with Daniel that maybe we shouldn't just look at the app stores. Maybe it's time to look at the operating systems too, to ensure that the ban is actually enforceable. And as for this whole change of laws and like, I think that like privacy laws and gambling laws certainly haven't brought the destruction of the government of the internet as we've seen it. And I think that that probably is a bit overstated in terms of saying a TikTok ban would wreak such havoc. But sorry, with that I yield.
Let's give 3 minutes to either Daniel or David to give their own response. We're starting to get questions, which we'll get to just after one of the two of you chimes in.
Yeah, so just to focus on the First Amendment for the moment, even under intermediate scrutiny, which would apply if this was truly a restriction on non-expressive conduct, it does certainly burden speech, even if that burden is only incidental, as the way I think Joel is trying to characterize it, and that would still subject the law to intermediate scrutiny. And under intermediate scrutiny, I think 3 of the panelists agree that the law will not be effective. It will not be effective in preventing the Chinese government from having access to US user data, and that is a fatal flaw. You can't, even under intermediate scrutiny, you can't significantly burden US people's speech, how they choose to communicate with each other, how they choose to restrict, to receive information by enacting a law that will not actually advance the interest the government is asserting. And so even under a less demanding scrutiny, this law still would not satisfy that. That doesn't mean that the US shouldn't be concerned with data flows to foreign adversaries. But again, there are other more effective ways of dealing with that, and those should be pursued. Those should certainly be pursued. And the problem, what we've seen is that every time Congress starts to focus on doing that, they get turned away, and now we're looking at TikTok instead of looking at comprehensive data privacy regulation. One last point I want to make that didn't come up earlier is the effect this has in terms of the U.S. standing in terms of international human rights. The U.S., in order to restrict TikTok, what the U.S. would have to do would be to carve out an exception to the Berman Amendments, which currently exclude from the CFIUS process the sanctions on foreign information services. The reason we have the Berman Amendment is that we could say to the rest of the world that we as a democratic government are not afraid of having information controlled by foreign adversaries come into this country. And by reversing that, we're saying to the statement, making the statement to the world that we are afraid. Yeah. And that, I think, is a significant harm to our standing in the international human rights community.
All right, we've got a question here from Mike Dunn, which I will ask and give both sides a chance to respond to. Let's just kind of do this one per side so we can get as many questions as possible in the next 10 minutes. Mike Dunn asks, if parties all agree that TikTok represents a significant national security risk, how does an outright ban inhibit First Amendment rights or the free and fair flow of commerce? Are there not other content platforms creators can use? What about an American company create our own version of TikTok? I don't know. Some might say, Americanize a Chinese technology the way sometimes it is argued China makes Sinoizes American companies. Anyway, we give both sides a chance to respond to this point by Mike Dunn. Who wants to go first?
Well, I wanted to point out in the question, it was implied that all 4 of us agree that the threat is real. But I heard one of the panelists question that. And as a technologist, I just want to make it clear that the Chinese are notorious for building these kinds of pipelines, as I said in my opening remarks. And I've seen firsthand evidence of that in DJI drones, which are basically consumer products. DJI drones they use GPS to track where they are. And if they're near a military or other kinds of sensitive installation, they start beaming video back directly to servers in China. Otherwise, they beam the same information to servers in the United States. So this is a real threat that we shouldn't take lightly. And so calling the question and forcing a ban in order to resolve these technological issues is really important. And I'll yield to discuss the legal aspects.
David or Daniel, do you want to respond to that question, Mike Dunn?
Yeah, I think I would just say that traditionally under First Amendment analysis, the fact that there are other venues available for speech to engage in does not mean that the government is legitimate in closing one down. So the government can't, for example, shut down a newspaper on the grounds that you can always go to public access television to make your points, right? It would still be a First Amendment violation to censor or shut down a newspaper or prevent somebody from printing something in a newspaper because of the content of what they have to say.
Okay. We have a question directed at a specific debater. This is from Rosalind Layton. For Dan Lyons, what kind of evidence do you need that TikTok is unsafe? The U.S. military and every national security and law enforcement agency testify that Chinese information technology presents an existential risk to safety and security to Americans. Rosalind also references the issue of people committing suicide after watching TikTok videos, instructing them to do so. This came up in the hearing at which the CEO of TikTok testified before Congress a month and a half ago.
Yeah, I think this relates back to the point Anton was making a little bit earlier, right? My point is that if Congress is going to enact this type of a decision, it needs to make fact finding of an extent that Montana did not. With regard to its ban, sort of laying out what exactly it has shown, right? Doing studies rather than anecdotes in order to prove there is some real national security harm that can come from continuing to allow this to be to allow TikTok to continue to operate. And that's important because you have to quantify the danger in order to decide whether the ban is narrowly tailored to address that danger. A danger that's largely hypothetical or that's largely conjectural doesn't give you the basis to do that second level of First Amendment analysis that's necessary to make sure that we're not showing more speech than necessary in order to achieve the government's interests.
We'll get
I wanted to, if I could follow up on that, I think that it's a great advantage to go through this legal process and even, to have the challenges occur, because one thing that the U.S. government does reflexively is not show its cards. So it was kind of a fault that the government declared TikTok a risk without going into details. And the instinct is, oh, we don't want to show the other side what we know. But I think in this case, we have to get to that point. And I'm hoping that the legal process will reveal that so that more Americans realize that, yeah, this is pretty nasty business going on here.
So I 100% agree with that. And I think the advantage of that type of transparency may cause TikTok users to be more self-aware, right? To engage in more sort of controlled dispensation of our data, which I think is one of the big problems we have in privacy more generally, is not just the need to restrict the flow of information legally, but to convince users that they should be more wise in what they do and don't share.
So can I respond to one thing, just because I think
go ahead, Joel.
There was a misstatement. So I think Daniel, I think it was Daniel who said that there was no fact-based finding in the Montana law. I mean, well, for someone who worked with the state AG's office on the bill, I can assure you that there actually was that a fact-based finding to promote that kind of idea. But so I don't want I just want to make sure that's on the record, that I don't think that it's a fair characterization to say that Montana just went wild and nuts and said we're just going to ban it for the hell of it. So there actually was a fact finding. So they did go through the legislature. There were hearings. I participated in one. I in fact testified in favor of it. So I think that it's just to be very clear here. And I don't think that Daniel meant to cast aspersions. I just think that I want to make sure that we're clear that this actually it did go through a legislative process. It's not just an executive order. There were some fact finding that went involved. So just want to make sure that point was on the record.
We have a question from Kate B. One of the panelists mentioned that the other social media apps and other mobile apps in general collect data that the Chinese government may collect and use in ways that it receives and uses data from American TikTok users. For the pro-ban side, could you share how you see the threat from TikTok as separate from the data security threats posed by these other apps?
I'm more than happy to defer to Anton, but I do think they're separate, independent. Like there are certainly, I mean, look, I think we all agree that there should be a federal privacy ban, a federal privacy law. I do think that we're all basically simpatico on that. But when you talk about surveillance versus privacy and data collection, those are two very independent things. And one may have something to do with the other, but they don't actually get you all the way there. For instance, TikTok has actually been the subject of many FTC proceedings, particularly one in which they were fined for a lot of their data collection practices. That doesn't really speak to the fact that they have these, that there are potential backdoors, that there are these potential avenues to continue to surveil even after you fine them X amount of dollars to, for their data practices. That doesn't really get to the heart of the issue when it comes to a TikTok ban. So I say, why not both? Why not a federal privacy law and a TikTok ban? I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
I do want to get Anton's perspective just on this point about surveillance. How do we know what you stated in your opening remarks about the privacy invasion / surveillance of TikTok?
Well, we don't know as much as we should, but we know China's track record. So I tend to believe what the government has found, but I would like to see, as the other panelists have pointed out, I would like to see this information disclosed so that Americans are much more aware and can judge. But as far as the other apps, I mean, it's outrageous that China basically built a superhighway of data directly to the Chinese government. I mean, that's just that goes way beyond what's acceptable. But we do need, we have.
Can you just refer to that superhighway? What is that superhighway that you're talking about?
Yeah, this is what the government alleges that the Chinese government has for China to collect data on Americans through TikTok. The evidence has not been publicly disclosed. It should be. But there may be other intelligence implications of that. I just don't know. But that's the problem. The government is kind of caught in between. How many of these cards should we show? Because it basically, it can reveal sensitive intelligence information. So we're kind of caught in between. But I believe that given what I know and what I've seen firsthand, that the Chinese government is entirely capable of that. In fact, they take pride in that. That's their MO.
David and Daniel, would you care to respond on these points?
Well, I don't think we should underestimate the surveillance value of the data that's freely available to foreign adversaries on data brokerage markets, even if we as a country might choose to regulate them in different ways, whether one would be regulated through FTC proceedings, other one might be regulated through CFIUS sanctions. They still are very valuable. I think it's maybe fine to say, well, we'll just do both, but we're not doing both. We're looking at spending a lot of time talking about banning TikTok, which again is going to affect millions of Americans whose threat model does not include, whose threat model should allow them to use this service without a threat to national security, and we're doing nothing about having data broadly collected. Otherwise, at a minimum, our priorities are backwards.
Okay. Do you want to add anything, Daniel?
Yeah, I would say I think Joel's right that you can be concerned about the state of American privacy law generally, and also recognize that TikTok represents a unique threat above and beyond that sort of threshold concern. So I wouldn't argue that some TikTok specific action isn't warranted here. I think that it absolutely is. My sense is just that a broad ban nationwide is far too extreme to address that concern.
All right. Well, we're gonna roll into closing statements. I'd invite each of the panelists to say 3 to 4 minutes in closing, and maybe some of you are going to go there or talk about commonalities or things that the parties have agreed on here, and then I'll just come back at after we minute up or so and close us out. But we'll go in the same order we started. Joel, your closing remarks here.
So, I mean, I think I'm walking away from this conversation pretty heartened. I think that there's a lot that we seem to agree on. I think that we definitely, to at least a certain degree, agree that, China, this issue with China surveillance is a problem, and we have to figure out ways in which to handle it. I don't think I heard anyone really say, it's absolutely not. I think the farthest anyone went was saying, well, maybe we need some more. And I think the argument that there should be some transparency into that process is, yeah, that should be part of this conversation. I totally agree that we should be able to see the data as if it truly is a imminent threat of our use of a particular service. We should know that, and we should be in the loop on that. I think all the panelists agree on that front. I think that the idea of pushing a federal privacy law is also on the table, and I think none of us here disagree that that isn't needed and warranted. I also really appreciate that. Although Daniel and David and I probably disagree on the First Amendment elements of this issue, we do agree that surveillance has to be part of that conversation. If not, if it's not separate and apart, at least look at ways to do both. So I think in terms of where we agree, I'm pretty happy where we ended up. On things where there's a bit of sticking points, and obviously there's going to be when it comes to talk of these types of measures. I do think that the First Amendment issues are overstated. And we don't have to go, I don't have to go back into it. I only have I think a minute and a half left. But I think at the end of the day, this really comes down to what are we protecting and how are we protecting it? And also, why are we protecting it? And I think in all of those three categories, a ban makes the most sense. I do admit that, some of the measures that have been taking place so far maybe not go as far as I would, and which is, I think the operating system is probably the correct way to go if you really want to enforce a full ban. But not to ramble on too much further, I think, look, I'm very appreciative that we all agree that China is an issue. We all agree that TikTok may be part of that broader Chinese surveillance play. I'm very excited to hear that we're not just looking at this from a pure privacy lens, but there's a surveillance lens as well. And I think that there probably is some room, even on the First Amendment side, to say, look, no one here said that there's a categorical bar on that the First Amendment provides. They said, well, there's some issues with it that we can work through. So again, I think that from that perspective, this has been a very productive conversation in that regard. And I think for reasons I stated, I do fully support it. And I don't think it's really a First Amendment issue, but I am also very interested to see how this plays out in Montana and other states, which I'm sure is on the way. But again, I really want to appreciate, Drew, you bring us together and at least having the hard conversation as to what needs to happen, how. So again, very much appreciated. Thank you for having me, and thank you for hosting.
Great, thank you. Let's hear from David for your closing remarks.
Yeah, I too am heartened by how much we agree on. And I think one of the things we agreed on is that a ban on TikTok is practically unenforceable. And I don't want us burdening the speech of millions of Americans for something that's not going to effectively advance what are very legitimate interests in protecting U.S. user data, both from commercial exploitation as well as foreign adversary surveillance. I also want to make sure that government is not acting just in terms of China animus against China for various geopolitical reasons, and not because of legitimate data privacy concerns. And I believe that having a law that really solely focuses on China instead of on data flows more broadly really runs that risk that we are legislating from that concern as well. The other thing I want to mention, we in these debates, and I've done a lot of them, we hear a lot about how China's security law, many countries require companies based within their doing business in the border to supply information. The U.S. does this as well. We have a robust national security letter system that is widely used to require online services to provide information to the U.S. government. The courts have most recently upheld the gag orders that typically get placed on U.S. companies. Facebook was just fined late last week by by the EU in the latest Schrems decision for not doing enough to protect EU user data from surveillance demands by the US government. So there's this is something that again happens sort of broadly among many countries. Again, this to me calls for a comprehensive approach is going to protect how US user data to satisfy many interests, the commercial exploitation interest, the personal autonomy interest, and the national security interest. Legislation and regulation that really focuses as a whole on how user data is collected, retained, and used is the far, far, far better way of addressing these concerns. Thanks.
Well, thank you, and thank you for wrapping early. David, we'll now turn to Anton for your closing remarks. 3 or 4 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge the value of TikTok. I mean, there are thousands of people who are building their businesses around TikTok. It's quite interesting, remarkable. I'm kind of surprised that there aren't American versions of TikTok yet, but I wouldn't rule it out. And I love this ban effort because it's really creating these kinds of conversations and much more. Because maybe in this case, ideally, we won't wait until the bridge falls down, until the government decides to fix it. Maybe we can be slightly more proactive despite what's been going on over the past several years. And presumably our intelligence agencies have been working behind the scenes, but we really don't know that. So this is the ban efforts are really very positive in that sense, and hopefully will create transparency as well. Also, we haven't mentioned when we talk about privacy laws, the European Union and GDPR. That's been in place for a few years now. It's not perfect, but it seems to work okay. So we don't have to start from scratch. I know that there's a set of privacy regulations, some kind of blueprint circulating in Congress, but it hasn't made its way very far yet, and that needs to really be pushed. But when we talk about user data, we also have to recognize that there are two sides to it. For example, I appreciate it when I see if I'm in the market for a new mattress and I get an email or I get an ad somewhere seemingly disconnected from where I'm shopping that says, hey, here's a good deal on mattresses or a lower interest credit card or something like that. So, we benefit in many ways by the sharing of information. I have a research group at Johns Hopkins that has developed a simulator for COVID and infectious diseases that uses this data that's been provided by the companies that collect it to drive mobility within a community. So the data can be used for beneficial purposes as well. And I think that there's value in promoting research to figure out how can we keep the good and get rid of the bad. Technologically, I think that it's very possible. In the future, we'll be looking back at this conversation and hopefully we'll be saying, yeah, sure, we can handle that now. So these are the kinds of conversations we need to have, but sharing data and, users allowing some data to be known, but selectively and knowingly, I think to strike that balance is important, and we need to promote more research in that area. And I think that the TikTok discussion is kind of a precursor to the next phase of what we need as a society from a technological point of view. So once again, thank you very much.
Well, and thank you for your closing remarks. The last word will go to Daniel Lyons, 3 to 4 minutes for your closing statement, then I will close this out.
Great, thanks. And thanks to my co-panelists. This has been a really good discussion. I'm really optimistic about the direction the conversation went. I appreciate Anton's point that transparency is important, that we sort of need to respect the importance of protecting state interests, but laying out the precise scope of the real threat that TikTok poses, right? Defining that important governmental interest is an essential prerequisite to determining whether a ban on TikTok burdens more speech than necessary to achieve that interest, right? You can't see, is it overbroad without defining what's the goal that we're trying to target for. And I'd also appreciate his point that privacy is something we need to consider within sort of the broader context of the internet ecosystem. Information flow is the lifeblood of the internet economy, and monetizing data is a good way that we keep services free that would otherwise be paid for, and making sort of advertising and other information better and more efficient. So there definitely is a role for information gathering as well as information privacy protection. That said, I remain convinced that a TikTok ban is a sledgehammer where I think a surgical instrument would be more useful. And probably a rubber sledgehammer, if that doesn't stretch the analogy too far, because it's unlikely to close off the spigot of data flow to Beijing, both from data from non-TikTok sources and also data from TikTok itself, as users will still be able to largely access and use the service. As the EU has learned, it's really hard to ban a service once it's widely adopted. And with 150 million users in the United States who are actively using the TikTok platform, I think it's really hard at this point to make an effective flat ban that will take that out of the zeitgeist completely. That said, I think there is room for regulations that are probably constitutional. So, for example, the TikTok ban on government-owned devices, right, which we've seen in roughly half of the states, probably more likely to be upheld. Government devices are uniquely susceptible to yielding valuable intelligence, and a ban on TikTok on government devices still allows citizens, government and non-government, right, to be able to use the service on private devices in ways that don't implicate the ban. So that's the sort of, I think, creative compromise thinking that's necessary to kind of find a meeting of the minds in this space, and I'm hopeful that we'll get there.
Well, thank you as well for your closing remarks. It's been a wonderful debate to hear these different perspectives and see where we disagree and agree upon. I want to remind everyone that we're here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. The next couple events include discussion on tribal broadband deployment next Wednesday, May 31st. On Wednesday, June 7th, we're going to do a special 2-hour session, Affordable Connectivity Fund Special Town Hall edition. 2 weeks, or I should say 3 weeks from today, we'll be unpacking the CHIPS and Science Act and talk about those provisions and what it's doing for semiconductor manufacturing. And that's in some ways in advance of our summit, the Made in America Summit that will take place on Tuesday, June 27th, all-day event. The registration for it is available on Broadband Breakfast. And then our next two events on the 21st and 28th include announcements about Middle Mile Award winners and the future of ultra high-speed connectivity. On behalf of our panelists who have participated in this debate, which include on the pro-ban TikTok side, Joel Thayer and Anton Dabura, and on the anti or don't ban TikTok, we heard from David Green and Daniel Lyon. On behalf of them and each of you who have been with us, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next week. Take care, everybody, and bye-bye.